In the spirit of Long Live the Church, I couldn't help but think about the question of what is the state of Sunday school? And we're going to talk a little bit about Sunday school. We're going to talk a little bit about parenting. But I think that it's important for us to think as we imagine the future of the church. I think so often we think about what are our kids going to do? How are they going to carry the torch? But before we get started, I always want to start in prayer, and then we can get going. So let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you so much for bringing us this weekend. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the nourishment that you have brought to each and every one of us. I pray for peace and imaginative hearts, and to be reminded that we, each of us would be reminded that you love our kids more than we can even imagine. Come, Lord Jesus, and offer us rest in the knowledge that salvation belongs to you. Amen. So what I love to do in these conversations is drop in a lot of authors that I'm reading all the time. And one of our favorites is Madeleine L'Engle. And I don't know, I'm sure you all know The Wrinkle in Time, but she wrote a lot of theological books in the 1970s, Walking on Water, all sorts of books. So check that out, and I'm going to start with her. In a very real sense, not one of us is qualified, but it seems that God continues to choose the most unqualified, i.e. parents, church leaders, to do his work, to bear his glory. If we were qualified, we would tend to think that we've done the job ourselves. If we are forced to accept our evident lack of qualification, then there's no danger that we will confuse God's work with our own, or God's glory with our own work. So just hang on to that. That's sort of the framework in which we are going to have this conversation. And the text that we're going to be looking at today is from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, 4-9. Abide in me as I abide in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must abide in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you abide in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Let's take a look and investigate in this word abide. To abide is to dwell, it's to reside, and it's to remain. Abide is a passive verb on our side. And it's an image reminding us that we can do nothing to be grafted to the branch. We do not graft ourselves to a branch. So as we consider how we parent and how we minister to kids and teens, we have to remember that we are fruit bearers that are grafted to a vine. So it's not up to us. We're not the source. We're not the creator. We remain in the creature space. So as we think about is Sunday school dead? What is the power of story, and how do we reclaim our imaginations? We want to hold on to this idea that we are not the source, we are not the creator, but we are creatures. So when it comes to the future of the church, we often hear in lots of circles. I travel across the country, and I'm with churches all over the place. And many times, churches will qualify themselves by the size of their Sunday school, or how many young people are there, or how diverse their congregation is. That's super, super common. And so I think that for so many of us, it's not in our consciousness, but so much of the future of the church, how we imagine what the church is going to be like, has to do with our imaginations around what our kids are going to do to contribute. Back in the day, I used to say all the time, Walt Disney is one of my favorite creators and founders. He's super imaginative and wild with the imagination. We love imagination. And one of the things he used to say about grown-ups is that our imagination grows flabby over time. And as I go around and travel across the country, I don't think that's really true, actually, because I hear a lot of grown-ups imagining a future that is in a place where God is not reaching out towards us or towards our kids. I think that our imaginations need to be reoriented all the time. And so I will just have to say that the devil would have you believe that the stories are not enough, and would have you imagine all the time, I hear this all the time, that kids are being cut off from God, causing us to forget that God is always abiding in us, and we will never be forsaken, and neither will our kids or the future of the church. So we don't imagine our future with the picture that God is doing the abiding. This is really important. He is holding on to us. It's so important for the way in which we imagine the future and our kids and the church. And our imagination needs to be primarily oriented towards God producing fruit. It informs our approach, and it really becomes our operational manual. And so if our jumpstart is in the wrong place, then it's really to envision and have freedom with our kids in a way that they really desperately want from us. And so ultimately, our imagination is shaped by the vision we have of ourselves and our teens, and it has so much to do with the footing that we imagine God has in our lives. So that's really, really important. I think it's easy for us to be external and to really project and think about, like, what is the big church doing, or what are my kids doing, or what is that Sunday school teacher doing? But really, I think so much of our own formation and the way that we shape our kids has to do with our own practice and acknowledgement and imagination about how God is moving towards us. So what about Sunday school? I am a super proponent of Sunday school. We have a curriculum. Our whole non-for-profit is reliant on the fact that Sunday school still exists, and it's an important fixture of the church, and it forms what's coming up ahead of us. But as I was digging into Sunday school and its inception, I found out a lot of good information, because I think we think about like the 1990s and we think, wow, we really went wayward in those 90s, and now we have this deconstruction, the millennials who are leaving the church by the droves, and where did we go wrong with Sunday school? Well, Sunday school never started in the place of abiding. Sunday school began in the late 1700s during the Industrial Revolution in England. And two gentlemen, and I think that they probably were Christians, but they had this idea, Robert Reichs and Thomas Stock. They took a look around them and they could see that kids were working. Kids worked 6 days a week, and they were working in factories. And so what they wanted to do was afford them the opportunity to move out of poverty. And so we have Sunday school. So they started Sunday school. It was like half a day. You were learning how to read and write. And the idea was that they were going to be elevated out of poverty, and that they would be curbing crime rate because kids were stealing because they were poor and they were working in factories. So that's where Sunday school started. It just like happened to be on Sunday that they didn't work. So if they had Monday or Tuesday off, we maybe have like Tuesday school. I don't know, but that's what it is. So Sunday school in its DNA, in its inception, was really about behavior modification and education. It wasn't about covering those kids in story. It wasn't about saying, hey guys, like you've been working, you're toiling, you're in the worst case scenario, and like let's tell you about where the balm of Gilead comes from. Like come here and know that you are known and loved and cared for. And it was really about a functionality, really. It was about lifting up this next generation and helping kids move out of poverty, which I think are all really good things. But if we go back a little bit further into the medieval period with the Jesuit missionaries, we can see that they had a whole different approach in catechism and education. They were all about the stories. They were all about covering us in the stories. Because when we think about Jesus and what he was up to, he was all about describing and coming to us with story. I love what Robert Capon had to say about story. He said that it's iconography that should be in our minds, not sure how they all sort of fit together, but that they belong there. And so the Jesuits took that same approach, and that's how they came to people, and that's how they shared God's big story, through plays, acting out the parts, meeting people where they were. And if you think about Joseph Haydn's 7 Last Words, that was he was inspired by what the Jesuits were doing. He was trying to help capture the imaginations of the indigenous people as the Jesuits moved throughout the Americas. And so that's really where I always thought Sunday school must have started with these stories. Like we were telling kids stories, we were telling them the gospel. That's where it started. But no, it started in education, and it started with the behavior modification. So that's what we see today all the time. You know, I go I travel all the time and people will say, this curriculum's terrible, or this is that, can we have StoryMakers? They want to make a shift. And the thing is that most curriculums are doing what it was meant to do. It's not something that is not, in line with what it is in its DNA. But we know inherently, I think, as Christians, that curriculum and education is not what captures our imaginations. So that's where the power of story comes in. God is an active agent, and he is always reconfiguring our imaginations through story. This is how he comes to us. Our hearts and minds need to be captured over and over and over again. And what we have to offer this next generation is creativity and story that quiet the storms of life and give us the courage to face the monsters under the bed. But we have this constant whisper. As we will go and move towards these stories, we constantly hear in our minds the enemy whispers, stirring fear and anxiety. Are these stories really enough? People ask me that all the time. Yeah, story, but what do we do next? So whether we're aware of it or not, so much of our hope relies on the next generation, what our kids are going to do, how they reflect who we are as a church, how they reflect who we are as parents. We hold on tight to reaching up, and we forget that we're creatures and not the creator. And this is why we educate, because educate is something that we can really control. They're modules that we can really control. It's like, I'm going to give you this information, and then if you recite that information back to me, I feel really good inside as a grown-up. I know that you've captured what I think means that you are a Christian, and then salvation is like checkmarked, and I'm not nervous that you may not be saved. That's the whole thing. So I think that's a deep part of what it is all about. One of the great truth tellers of the late 1800s, 1986, was Whitney Houston when she sang The Greatest Love. I believe the children are the future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. So this isn't just one thing that's like, only church people do this, only religious people do this. The world does this. We are all looking for an escape hatch. We're looking for a savior. Everywhere we go, we are looking for someone to, she says, never walk in anyone's shadow, but actually we desperately need to walk in a shadow, and it should be Jesus' shadow, and we need the covering all the time. And so I think that's what we do as parents and Christians, and also just the world in general. It says everything about us, and it's in the DNA of our formation. For the world of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, is the world of story. A story which may be able to speak to us as the Word of God. Think back to your own childhood. Think back to the stories that captured your imaginations. Think back to the time that you were drawn into another world, extracted, brought into Never Never Land, and God spoke to you. This is where you want to remain when you are thinking about, how do I employ formation at home? How do I employ formation with my kids at church? You want to remain in the place where you were extracted from your world. As a kid, I vividly remember first reading the BFG, which is the Big Friendly Giant. I don't know if you guys, Roald Dahl is one of my all-time favorites. He includes tragedy, joy, is really close to Bible stories. He has sacrificial love. There's always something really tragic that happens right away, and then the whole story unfolds. And I remember that, and I remember when I think back to Isaiah and the seraphim and the giants, we have all those components in our own Bible. The way that God speaks and awakens Samuel in the middle of the night, and he places life where there is no life in the wombs of Hannah and Elizabeth. There's so many wild things that happen in the story, and so I think it's so important just to live there, stay there with your kids. He affords courage and bravery to the midwives, Rahab. What God does with women in the Old Testament is incredible. And so I think too, as you have maybe young teens, young college students, and when people may say like, well, the Bible is just so like unmodern, I can't, how does it even connect with the culture? God was doing something so radical with women well beyond our day and age. So the Old Testament comes to us vividly, uninhibited, and full of surprises. And you may say that God took liberty with his approach when it comes to story. So what happens to all of us grown-ups? How does our imagination get so skewed? I remember being a kid, and I've always had an active imagination. I was always a little bit of a daydreamy kid, kind of a kid. But I think what ends up happening with a lot of us grown-ups is that our imaginations shift and that muscle moves towards the negative. We begin to imagine that the monsters under the bed are coming for us and there's no one to protect us. That's what ends up happening. And so then we start to clench, and then we start to say, I don't know if these stories are enough. I don't really know. Am I chosen? Am I adopted? Am I attached to the vine? Because we're always looking for external factors to say, like, is this thing true? I don't know if I'm really changing. I'm really still anxious. I don't know if I'm a brave person. If we don't have a behavior outcome to assure me that I'm changing, then maybe this God thing isn't enough. So many of us are prey to the fear and the whispers of the devil. It's up to you. Can you really trust God? Look, you haven't changed that much. You're an impatient parent. You're not that great in Sunday school. I heard you answer that, teen. That was way, way, way off. We get hung up wondering if we're telling the story correctly. We lose the ability to spark creativity and find curiosity where, it's not super obvious. And we can forget that God can do wonders like turn water into wine, bring sight to the blind, move heaven and earth to come for you. I definitely grew up in the 90s at the height of what was Sunday school culture, but now I know in my research, I'm like, oh, Sunday school is always like that. This is no different. But I remember growing up and going to youth group and being told if everyone in our youth group brought 2 people to Christ, he had this like crazy math problem. It's like if every youth group across the world brought 2 kids to Christ, then the whole world would be saved and we'd all be raptured, like no one's left behind. So then it was like, okay, I'm 13, I'm in the 7th grade, I got this, I can do this. And so for like about 1 or 2 weeks, I took my Bible with me to school and was like, I'm just gonna hang out in the lunchroom and then find some kids, and I just need to really find 2, and if everyone finds 2, then we're really good. And that was super awkward. I went to this kind of a sketchy middle school that was like bulldozed down because it was super underperforming, lots of gang members at this school. I mean, it was not really the place to I was really weird. It was really weird that I did that. So after a couple weeks, I was like, I think I'm just gonna slink back and not do that anymore, and just maybe I'm gonna run for student council. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna run for student council and just be kind of a normative middle school kid. And so I abandoned my fundy approach and I ran for student council, which you'll all be pleased to know that I won. I had these little trolls. My dad was he was a film guy, so he could do a green screen, which was crazy for 1992. I was like, this is so awesome. And then we played Technotronic in the background, which pump up the jam. I was definitely one and the only kid with the video. So that was really awesome. So I abandoned that idea because it didn't capture my imagination that I could actually save anybody. Anybody else? Technotronic. When the lie creeps in and we hope for proof of faith, our approach towards our kids is covered in fear and not freedom. Because if we're looking for external factors to make sure that we are in Christ and that these stories are enough, then those stories are going to get really shoved down and all the oxygen in the room leaves. Suddenly fear takes the front seat and our relationships are bound in half-truths and disconnection, because kids ask really hard questions. And little kids ask them, teens ask them, and then if we're skewed and we're not super sure and we don't trust the stories fully, we get tripped up. We say weird things, and then kids are not sure that we're sure because we definitely aren't sure. Right now, there are 2 formidable books going out right now. I don't know if you guys heard of Anxious Generation. If you have Instagram, it's probably all over your feed. Now it's going to be on your feed because I just said it out loud. And then the second book that is out there is Bad Therapy. That's Abigail Schreier. And these are two formative books, and these two authors are telling us that there's a shift in the culture, and they want to protect the future of our kids. But ultimately, it's like goes back to that Whitney Houston thing. They want to protect society, really. They want to make sure that we're not going to go off the cliff because we're too anxious, we're desperately depressed, we are suicidal. This is a way in which we are being storied, and this generation is being storied. So it's not just a Christian thing that we care about what our kids are up to, but it's also a world thing, because we see our kids as our future and the way forward. It is as though we expect these unattached branches, i.e. our children, to bear fruit, when in reality, they cannot do that on our own. And who can blame us? This is a natural place of self-preservation. It's a ripple effect from the garden, that sneaky snake in our ears over and over and over again. Are you sure God has this? Are you sure the stories are enough? You may want to reach up and make sure everything works out as planned. Parenting and leading kids is so much about being trusted that we are grafted to the vine. And if we parent trusting that God is holding on to us and our kids, we parent from a place of grace and playfulness, everything is so much lighter. You can be present, you can stop what you're doing, because it's not a curriculum, it's not about educating them, and it's not about outcome, it's about being present, making that story real, and having a real connection. I've been reading The Creative Act. I don't know if you guys all been reading that too. It's a really great book. And one thing he has to say is that we are all participating in a creative act, i.e. parenting or ministry. We are not conducting. I think this is so important. We are participating. We are in the creative act. We are in the story. Think Jesuits. We are in this story. We are not conducting. We are being conducted. And I know, free will thing. I think that that's such a freedom, really, especially when you're parenting or you're leading a ministry, to know that you are playing a part. God has you in a role, and that this is his story, and it's not ultimately up to us. But somehow, us grown-ups inevitably fall into temptation of taking over and thinking that we are conducting the whole thing and it's up to us. It's just too much. So I want to highlight a few things. We always do this thing in StoryMaker World where we talk about assess and confess. I think it's really important, especially as we all want to be invited to Thanksgiving. We all want to have connections with our kids. We all want kids to return back to church. So it's important for us to take a beat and always understand, where may I be taking control? Where maybe am I holding on too tight? So we have to ask ourselves, are we genuinely curious about the kids in front of us, or the teens in front of us, or the people we're ministering to in front of us? Are we really present and curious about them? Or do we see them as an ultimate means to the end? Are they the saviors of the church? Do we engage with them, or are we educating them in such a way because we ultimately think that, you're the future of the church. I got to make sure we're embedding everything properly inside of that brain of yours and your heart and your mind and your soul. And do we think that their success and their level of engagement determines our story ultimately? So it's always important to take a beat. We talk about stop, breathe, pray, assess, and confess all the time. Roald Dahl had this great quote about grown-ups, that we should always be growing down. And I think this is such a Christian statement. This all linked into the assess and confess. We should be in the downward cycle always of growing into interdependence of our Creator and entrusting our future and our kids' future to him. This makes all the difference. He will do all the saving, and then you have all sorts of room for creativity and real connection. So when we think of the church and its longevity, and we think of the generation who will carry on the torch well beyond us, who will lead the way, it's important to know that where our trust lies, how we're engaging our kids, and where we can confess in our subconscious that we are hoping our kids will take us back to Neverland, i.e. the garden. So beyond Whitney Houston in the late 80s, we also had other sirens calling. One of my favorites was the Biosphere in the 1990s. I'm from Arizona, and I'm from Tucson, and my uncle did all of the landscape architecture. So when I was a kid, my sister and I were like, oh my gosh, this is science at work. And we have a front row seat. This is amazing. But the biosphere was like a whole hoax, right? So it was a new Earth, new Eden. And this was an attempt to bring the garden here. And the biosphere was a second chance of a pure environment where people could live and grow in peace and harmony. And that's oftentimes the way that we approach Sunday school. So every year, every cycle, when our kids, even in the fall, this is so much like back to school stuff. It's like, okay, moms, like we're really gonna do it this year. You know, this is a year that we really form them. So, and I think of that as like biosphere-like. And it's not just in the church, it's everywhere. My husband and I have been in New York City for almost 20 years, and so we were there during pandemic. We're there through all the things. Someone asked us when the pandemic started, they're like, are you and your kids going? And we just thought, well, if we go, what does that say? Stories are not enough, for sure. So we hunkered down, and we stayed in New York, and during that time, Jake was doing live streaming with the church, and we were just exhausted. And we live in a church building, which is probably not super normal, but we live in this church building, and our staff live there, and our community lives there. And so we had all been like really good and following all the rules, but then we thought, well, I think we're just exhausted. We need to see each other, and we have a rooftop, and I think we could all hang out, and everyone could bring something, and let's just try not to like kill each other with COVID. I think it's gonna be okay. But everyone's like super anxious because we are like living in our little places. So we go on up, and during this time, the thrust of BLM had just gotten started, and I live on Park Avenue, so when anything happens in New York, I know about it first. It is just like a tunnel that comes down from Washington Square Park all the way through Park Avenue. And so we're up there, anxious, probably a little neurotic, not quite sure what we're doing. We're all hanging out up there. We're grilling, and my daughter, who's 13 at the time, we're just like hanging out there, and the protest grew louder and louder. And I have a super anxious neighbor, mid-hot dog, turned over to Sophia, who's 13 at the time, in all seriousness, asked her, what is your generation gonna do to change the world? And in that moment, I was like, oh, that's like too much. Like, I was already nervous coming up here with the hot dogs, and now here we go. So in that moment, though, and Sophia is this anxious person generally, I could just see the flood of anxiety coming over her. It's like, save the world from injustice, global warming, political strife. Like, what's the thing that I'm supposed to do? And if this question, if we're all honest, like it was a truth teller of where so many of us live. She wanted this kid to save her. She saw her as a clean slate. She's like, this is my biosphere right here in front of me. And she was hoping that fruit come from a vine that was not attached, that isn't the vine, you know, she's the branch. And so this is what we do all the time. So when we think about assess and confess, that's what you want to think about. This is where anxiety comes up as grown-ups. It comes into our minds and sometimes spills out into the world. And I think in those moments, you know, there's so much room for redemption. You know, I don't want to like pinpoint my neighbor in this way that's like, oh, that was really not the right thing to say. But I think, you know, we have these opportunities as grown-ups to say like, oh, sorry, that was like way too much. I'm really anxious right now. I'm so sorry, Sophia. Like, you can do nothing. You're in the 7th grade. And you don't even go to school right now because we're in a pandemic. But that, you know, I just want you to hold on to that because like the assess and confess thing, we can just kind of like sit in that assessy part and like, oh, I'm just like the worst person. And it's like, well, sometimes I say the wrong thing all the time and you just get familiar with that wrong rhythm that you have. And then maybe you say sorry for it and you make some shifts in your family. You know, there's lots of opportunity for redemption in the micro as well. So when our focus is misaligned and oriented in the wrong direction, our ability to grow down, like Roald Dahl says, is lost in this, and the story gets lost too, and the creativity gets lost, and curiosity gets lost. And we think about the Old Testament, there's like littered with misapplication of anxiety and fear. I think about Aaron and the golden calf. I just like, Moses is away, everyone's getting freaked out, and Aaron is just like trying to project manage this whole situation. situation. He's like, I don't know, I'm so sorry we built this thing because they were like freaking out and they could kill me and you were away. It was like super stressful. Like, I feel really bad for Aaron. And then you've got the Tower of Babel, the kings, judges, all of them. So when you look at the Bible, you stick with the stories, you can see that we're constantly postured towards reaching for the heavens. We're so anxious and we're so afraid, rather than living on bended knees and trusting the future, the church, our kids, ourselves, ultimately to God. We need to remember over and over again that we're soaked in story. And this is why we're all here. I mean, it is Saturday. We are in San Diego. It's so nice. And like, we're in this like room. It's kind of cool, but like, I mean, you could be kayaking, but you're here because you've been baptized and your imaginations were captured at one point. And we ourselves want to be connected to the vine, and we want to be reminded that the stories are true over and over again. And we need friends and we need community to remind us that these stories are true. And so with our kids and in ministry, that's what we get to do. We get to remind them, like, yo, this story is really true. Last week, Jake, or maybe a couple weeks ago, Jake and I were on a podcast together chatting about Job. And I was thinking back about, this. I was like, Job is such a good book for teens because they are always catastrophizing and he's literally in the worst case scenario. And I thought about Job and I thought about the way my youth minister came to me and talked to me about proselytizing my peers at the lunch table. It would have been so much better if he talked to me about Job rather than trying to tell me to save kids. But his imagination needed to be reclaimed. And from his vantage points, he didn't want any kids left behind, and he couldn't see that they were grafted already to the vine. In Anxious Generation, this is another plug for the book. It's so good. He also talks about the biosphere too. So I was all on board. I was like, oh, Jonathan Haidt's talking about the biosphere too. This is amazing. But one of the cool things that he mentioned that I didn't know about, was that they planted trees inside of the biosphere. I don't know if you guys remember this, but what was so wild about those trees is that they grew very quickly to maturation because there were no external elements in the world, no wind, no rain, no disruptions of growth. And I think that so much of our approach is to kind of like have this biosphere experience with our kids and Sunday schools. It's like, if we just have everything perfect, if everything is perfectly planned and everything curated, then our kids are going to grow to be strong and big. But what was so interesting is what happened to these trees is that they never grew deep roots because it didn't have any natural forces coming up against them. And what happened was that they got to maturation and they totally collapsed. And the same, I think, is so true for our spiritual and emotional life for our young people. They're fragile and their imaginations are often disoriented because we've given them sanitized stories in Sunday school. We've kept the elements away from them, the context of story. Kids and teens in the 90s were given superficial versions of God's story because the imaginations of grown-ups were in the driver's seat and they imagined the worst case scenario, which, by the way, I mean, I don't know if it's as bad as it made it sound like when I was a kid, but they didn't want anyone to get pregnant, to drink. Well, drugs, that's pretty bad. And they didn't want anyone to be left behind. And all of those things happened either way. The law only increased the trespass, and we were left with a generation collapsing by the elements of life because they weren't given the stories, trusting that God was abiding in them and whoever comes next. So what we have to offer kids and everyone around us is really the possibility to be tethered to hope. And that's what stories do. They pull us outside of ourselves. I'm like the Bible lady. I think you just get into the Bible, you get into these stories, and you're extracted from yourself, or you identify with certain characters, or you can say, like, I feel anxious like Aaron. Like, I, at my workplace, am acting like Aaron all the time. I'm just sort of giving in to the people because I feel super anxious. There's so much there for all of us. So we want to cover everyone in the promises of God through these stories. Think of the Hebrews escaping Pharaoh, and they were just set free. We just have this issue And that's why we need the stories so much, and I'll just keep harping on that. But when the Hebrews came out, what happened? They started to complain right away. Like, they didn't like the water. They got sweet water, so good on God to do that. Then they were hungry, so then they got manna, but then they were holding on to it because they were like, I'm not quite sure if I trust you. Is there going to be more tomorrow? That's just who we are as people, and that's why we have to get into the assess and confess rhythm all the time, because that's part of our human nature. So what I'm proposing that we think about is getting back to the story in a very medieval sense. We talk a lot about embodying the story because it shifts us and it changes us. This is why we can play when we get into the story, and it's the only narrative that allows us to have fun, curiosity, connection, and integrated lives to reclaim our imaginations. So if you're thinking about, like, how do I reclaim my imagination? How do we get reoriented? It all has to do with playing the parts. Play says yes to the left and the right side of our brains, and it allows us to see life in full color, in peace and with hope. It's an active discipleship. We embody the story. We play the parts with our kids. It fosters positive memories around faith. So if you are at all hoping that your kids return to church, are excited about faith, if you get in on these get playing with your kids, they are way more likely to come back, or to feel that these stories were true, or to feel like, oh, my parents really connected with me here. And it was so fun when my dad was ridiculous with those voices, or my mom like really stepped out of her normal zone of being in charge of things and just let go. But that can only happen when we trust the stories. And that can only happen when we have our imaginations seeing God moving towards our kids over and over and over again. God is storying us differently from the world. He is leading the way, and he is teaching us well, so we can rest knowing that Gen Z and Alpha, and by the way, I would say this year or next year is going to be beta. So just, fun facts, Gen Z were people who were born from 1996 to 2007, 2007 to what we have today, that's Alpha, and then Beta is just around the corner. I don't know about you guys, but there's been a baby boom in 2024, so there are a lot of Betas coming forward. But anyway, I segue. God is storing us differently from the world, and he's leading the way, and there's hope where there are stories. His stories reorient our imagination. They hold us and they keep us grown-ups when we operate out of fear rather than an invitation to the greatest story ever told. He's doing something way more interesting. Over this summer, we had this really fun thing happen in StoryMaker land. So we create this is what we call zines. They're Bible stories, and we create them, we sell them. We also give 50% of them away all over the world. And this summer, we had this really fun thing happen. We heard from our global partners in Bolivia. There's an orphanage, and we're serving kids there, and we're serving teens there with our resources. And then we heard from our partners in Ensenada, which is just around the corner, and it's a place that I went to as a kid, and they are using the zines too. And then we heard from our friends in Carlsbad. And so they were all doing the creation story in the month of July. And I just thought, God's imagination is wild. Like, here we are, and we're sort of doing the thing that my youth minister hoped I would do, like get some people into the kingdom. And here we are, and God had this crazy, wild way of doing what he was going to do anyway. So when I gave up and joined student council, God was like in the move the whole way through. It doesn't really matter what I did. He was going to do what he was going to do anyway. So you have kids in different zip codes, different hemispheres, doing God's story or engaging in God's story. That is the picture. That's what we're trying to get at. We don't want to live in education. I hate the word curriculum. It's so unsexy. It's not fun at all. It's like when people come up to us, they're like, what's your curriculum like? I'm like, we do stories. That's way more exciting for kids and way more exciting for me. And like, who wants to do curriculum? So to abide is to dwell, to reside or remain. To abide is a passive verb. And it's an image reminding us that we can do nothing to be grafted to the branch. So as we consider Sunday school and its role in the church, and long live the church, we must remember that we are fruit bearers that are grafted to the vine. His story is a long story. And I'll end with this. Our imaginations and approach to young people has so much, remember I said this at the beginning, it has so much to do with the footing of God in our own lives. If we imagine God is making all things new, we can trust that there can be fun, curiosity, art, play, and we can fully trust that the stories are enough. The kid who abandoned the fundy approach was a teen who knew, ultimately, that I was loved. And despite my youth minister's attempts to story me and to saddle me up with a savior complex, I ultimately knew it wasn't up to me. What sweet freedom that is. So for each and every one of you, it's not up to you. Just hang on to the stories. God is covering you in them. He's saturating you in them. We are addicted to story, and there's a reason for that. So last week, I was in Texas, just outside of Austin, and I was leading a retreat for parents with young children, 0 to 5. And we were doing play and doing all the StoryMaker fun stuff. And a dad asked me, this was like the end note of the whole thing. I always do Q&A. And that always gives you the heartbeat of what's in the room. And at the end, this really sweet dad who had a 1-year-old child asked me, like, what do you do, though, about the shame of not teaching your kids well or teaching them the faith right? And I said to him, and I say this to all of us today, close your eyes and imagine that God is running towards you, and the stories are for you too, and that God has got you and has grasped you, and the fruit is going to come not because of you, but because of who you are attached to. So I would say take a look around and be encouraged, because everyone inside of this room who's not kayaking or at the beach is saying, had a moment. We've all had this moment somewhere in our history, in our experience. God has come to us and it tucked into our hearts. Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Remember, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whoever you're connected to, remember that God's story is a super long story, and he is the vine, we are his branches, and we simply get the pleasure of delighting in the fruit that he produces through story. So get curious, play, and just have fun.